When I'm thinking about this infrastructure, I'm thinking about several words. First thing is about sustainable growth, because without infrastructure, no country can actually achieve sustainable growth, which means the economy can grow in a very stable way and in a sustainable way. Second word is about the efficiency, because infrastructure actually is the key for the economy to achieve the efficiency. Third word is about fairness, because for the people in this society, if they can access infrastructure, actually this means people actually can live in a world with fairness. Because infrastructure is not a kind of luxury goods only for this for the rich people. When the society becomes more fair, then the infrastructure is so important. Here, infrastructure, in my mind, actually defined as quite a physical infrastructure, like toll roads, like these ports, all these things. Another part is quite soft, like a social infrastructure. So in my terminology, I always treat them equally, which means infrastructure not only cover this hard assets, but also kind of soft. When Alex mentioned Alibaba, actually, I believe internet is another kind of important infrastructure today. For example, we build up some network in Indochina Peninsula. This can provide IT services to the country, to the people in that countries like Laos, like Myanmar, like Cambodia. We believe this kind of infrastructure could not be ignored. And in fact, because of this the current this society, this kind of infrastructure can help people to offset the gap between the poor country and the developed countries. So I'm very happy to discuss more and to have a brainstorm with everyone sitting here, with the friends sitting here on the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Can I have a very quick follow-up question on that, the telecom projects you just mentioned? Can you elaborate a little bit more from the Pan-Asia perspective? Are there any really strategic infrastructure projects on telecom connecting people?
Yeah, I think because ASEAN is using this connectivity, and I strongly believe that telecom connectivity is one of the key. But unfortunately, so far, I did not see any very complete and concrete blueprint for this connectivity in terms of the telecom. The good thing is that some entrepreneurs are working on this. For example, we are supporting one project in Indochina Peninsula. They just building up this underground fiber network to connect several countries, to provide this fiber network to support this telecom. So this is one project. I call this is a key telecom connectivity. Based on that, some companies are talking about 3-in-1 this is a system in Indochina Peninsula, which means they combine the internet, this digital TV, and also voice services together as a kind of IT system. I believe this is another kind of connectivity, connect people together and provide IT services to the people for the connection. Yeah.
So much so, because every time we travel, the first minute we land at any airport, we want to turn on our mobile phone and see if there's any Wi-Fi, right? So
absolutely. So in Myanmar, it's very difficult in the past years, I think.
I don't know if anyone from ASEAN, I mean, the Philippine Consul General is office people here also, some other. Maybe when the day comes, AEC comes, maybe they can all connect free Wi-Fi among ASEAN countries? Hopefully, huh? But I want to ask you one question before I pass on to the second. Dr. Lee, can you share with us a little bit more directly from your fund's perspective, what are your most favorite baby projects, and what are the projects that keep you awake in the middle of the night?
We love all these projects. We love all these infrastructure sectors. But to be frank, I believe that some projects, if they can fit more these countries' industry policy, and also line with the society's development level, then I think that project could be more favorable. I mean, can reach higher impact combined with good commercial return. I believe that for infrastructure projects, we should balance the impact and also commercial return. So that's why we promote PPP. Somehow, some projects you cannot just finance by the commercial sectors. They should be subsidized by the government and supported the government. So for our fund, we like some projects in the China Peninsula like telecom, and also a tower project in Indonesia. We also like some social infrastructure projects in this region. So we love all of these projects.
Thank you. That sounds a very diplomatic answer anyway. Clinton, why don't you share with us some the World Bank's perspective, okay? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Let's see.
Yeah, sorry.
Could we put the set of slides, please? Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. What I thought that I would do is sort of put a little bit of context in terms of the discussion and in terms of what's been happening. I'll skip what the needs are. Suffice to say that the needs are great. The question is, how do we actually attract public funds and private funds together to actually make things work better? So I couldn't work for the World Bank or the World Bank Group without giving you a little chart, right? So here's your little chart. And what's interesting here is this is a little database that we run from our office in Singapore. And what we do is we look at private participation in infrastructure. And we focus mainly on water, energy, transport, sort of looking at a much more sort of hardcore infrastructure, leaving telecoms aside because telecoms sort of has its own momentum, has its own dynamic. So what's interesting here is what the trend has been over the past year, which is downward, right? So what's interesting here as well is that the values of projects are remaining sort of on average the same size of projects, but you're also seeing that the number of projects has actually decreased. So it's about just under 30% decrease of projects from the last year. Why this is an interesting reflection, right? Because so we talk a lot about bringing in private sector monies into infrastructure. We talk a lot about governments actually putting money into infrastructure. The reality is that the need is there, the pipeline is there, but the project implementation, that's where the failure is. The project implementation trends are very low. Another little sort of interesting factoid here is which countries are doing more. And if you look at China, Brazil, Chile, India, Mexico, you actually see that China is the one that's doing the most number of projects. So in terms of numbers of projects, China leads the ranking. But Turkey actually is the one that leads the ranking in terms of volume. You look at what the Turks have done. The Turks have a tradition of PPPs that goes back over 30 years, in fact. The interesting thing about the Turkish market is that it's a very insular market. It's a market that just is Turkey's for the Turks. In Turkey, when you look at the major PPPs that they've been doing, they're sponsored by local sponsors and local banks. So that's an interesting reflection for the region, right? Particularly for China, I would say. So what's happening today for Turkey is, how do I actually open up the market? In the case of Brazil, Brazil continues to be one of the major players in PPP. They have some very big tickets in Brazil. The notion here in this region, in ASEAN region in particular, is we have a lot of initiatives. We've got the ASEAN, what they call the MPAC, the Master Plan for Connectivity, with a whole bunch of very big projects. But actually, when you look at implementation of those projects, it's actually falling very, very short of what it should be. This is just a little bit of numbers for you to take, and these slides are available for anybody that you'd like to take them. Let's look a little bit about the barriers, particularly in the region. And the barriers are related to project preparation, quite frankly. So a lot of projects out there, a lot of political statements being made about what can and cannot be done. But the reality is, when you have a hard look at the projects and you actually look at the feasibility of the projects, that's when things begin to fall. They begin to fall because this balance between public and private and between risk and risk reward is not there. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in the region, is actually making sure that we can push the pipelines, get those feasibilities done, so that we can actually go out to the market with realistic projects. If we want to do PPPs, as Dr. Lee was saying, is if we want to do PPPs, there needs to be the right balance. There is no point in having an expectation to bring in the private sector in roads or in water when the basics of revenue streams are not there. So when those revenue streams are not robust enough, what can we do? How do we use government resources or public resources into PPPs in the most efficient way? That's the challenge for this region. The biggest challenge is then to design structures that allow us to recognize ex ante that some of this is going to have to be subsidized. There is a public good component to building infrastructure. So how do I do that? How do I do that in a way that would provide revenue certainty so that the private sector can come in? So that the private sector can say, yes, I'm prepared to invest upfront a vast amount of money and recover my money over 35 years of running the asset. And it's all really about creating that revenue certainty. This is a little slide that I like because it gives a little bit of a view of what's trying to happen in a traditional PPP. If you look at what happens in a given project in infrastructure, you've got your revenue line. And your revenue line is basically user fees, tolls, tariffs, whatever, and government transfers. But when you look at your costs, and when you bring in the private sector, so you've got capital expenditures, you've got actually operational expenditures, you've got to run the thing. Then whatever money you've borrowed, you've got to service, and fantastically enough and amazingly enough, the private sector wants to make some money. So how do we balance that? And that's really the big debate, is so if I, as the public sector, can borrow cheaper, why would I bring in the private sector, right? Well, the answer is efficiency. And it's efficiency in terms of costs. It's efficiency in terms of capital costs, in efficiencies in terms of overrun costs with respect to construction, with respect to operating the asset, right? And what you try and do then is lower regulatory and political risks. That's fundamental. It's fundamental because it gives the right rules of engagement. If we can set what those rules of engagement, and we have certainty of rules of engagement, things will work. A perfect example is what the Chileans did with the water sector. They started in the 1990s. They set the regulatory regime. They set very clearly what would be the rules of engagement for tariff increases, and to set a regulatory regime that was consistent. And that's the name of the game, consistency in terms of the rules of engagement, in terms of regulatory provisions. So if we can achieve that here, then we're going to move things. The reality is, whether we like it or not, the hard truth in the ASEAN region is that political and regulatory uncertainty is the biggest risk that investors face. Thailand being an example. We've got a country that, from a capital markets perspective, functions fantastically well. In Thailand, they're issuing bonds, the proceeds of which are going into infrastructure. The holy grail of infrastructure, right, is that we could issue bonds, get the capital markets to put their money into local infrastructure so that we avoid things like, currency mismatch and so forth. Yet, political uncertainty comes to the fore. So we've got to create those rules of engagement that allow that protection to investment. We've got to look at things like how do we increase competition? How do we avoid the strong players taking monopolistic positions? One of the biggest challenges that, for example, Brazil lives today, despite, as I showed you in the earlier slides, that Brazil kind of leads the tables in terms of PPPs, the biggest problem in Brazil today is a very similar problem to what's happening in Turkey. And that's that you've got a bunch of entrenched interests and companies that are winning between 85 and 90% of all the projects. So it's a good problem to have, quite frankly. At least you've got that pipeline, things are going. But we've got to create those rules of engagement. We've got to open up the market so that real competition can happen. We avoid cartel-type behavior, and we can actually drive down costs. The issue in Brazil today is, the fact is, when we did it, we did a little sort of internal briefing paper for the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. And what we found there is that the average cost of construction in Brazil has not come down. So in Brazil, it's as expensive to build a road as it is in Vietnam. What a shocker, right? Mexico's price of building 1 kilometer of road has gone progressively down in the past 10 years by around 22%. In Brazil, flat. So competition is not working there enough. But that's just an example of the sorts of things that we need to think about when we're designing the structures in this region. So we've got some good, strong players. How do we encourage those players to play well? And how do we encourage other players to come into the market? A little note here, which I think is a fundamental reflection here in terms of what the new BRICS Bank can do, in terms of what the Asian Development Bank can do, in terms of what the new entities can do. And that's that if we do PPPs, at the end of the day, all of the things that we talked about here in terms of lowering regulatory risk, political risk, and so forth, that's where the multilaterals or the IFIs or whatever we call these entities can actually have a serious role to play. And that's actually in backstopping government obligations. If we can establish a mechanism by which government obligations can be backstopped by an entity such as the Asian Development Bank or the BRIC Bank or the World Bank, where liquidity constraints or liquidity concerns can be offset by these banks actually putting their balance sheet against a given event, then we're moving the paradigm. What is the alternative? The alternative is to do what we've been doing as the World Bank for the past 50-odd years, what the ADB's been doing, which is funding the public sector, right? Not necessarily looking at efficiency, simply funding public engagement. The future is not that. The future is, yes, indeed, get some cheap money in to resolve the public part of a PPP, the sort of public portion of a PPP. But more fundamentally, it's about actually using the balance sheets of these entities better. I'm always amazed. I mean, I work for the World Bank. I was talking to our CFO about a month ago, and I said, you do realize that we must be the worst leveraged bank in the world? It's got a fantastic balance sheet. We do nothing with it. Honestly, we do nothing with it. So if I'm going to create a BRICS bank, or I'm going to create another bank, one of the metrics I would establish is leverage. Leverage, not necessarily defined in the same way as a private bank would or a more commercial bank would, but indeed the notion of leverage, and how do we achieve that? A few little reflections just in terms of what we could do just to wrap up. Some issues about project pipeline that I mentioned. So the whole notion of developing good projects is developing projects that actually have network effects. Projects that are not done in isolation. Projects that actually look at this whole notion of connectivity, something that's talked a lot about here in ASEAN region. Connectivity is important, great. So how come Vietnam launched, what was it, I think 7 ports at the same time? What that did to the region was actually bring down the prices in all ports. A big problem. So it's not just about building things. It's actually about making sure that you build the right things, that you're making sure that you're actually finding the right network effects. How am I linking a port to the local network of roads? How am I making sure that whatever I'm developing actually does have that economic benefit? So fundamental in terms of developing pipelines is actually having a system for adequate prioritization. And that's, I think, one of the key things that the region needs to look at better. It's not just about having the list of projects. It's actually about having a list of projects that is meaningful, that is prioritized, that actually looks at how it's linked to other projects and what the ultimate benefit should be. So very important to get that basic balance right. Risk, I think we talked about it. True believer that if we're going to do PPPs, the notion of backstopping government obligations, providing liquidity relief to investors in the event that you've got a crisis, you're unable to increase the tariff as the contract provides for, and so on. Those are sort of real, tangible actions that you can take in terms of reducing risk perception and actually providing very specific mechanisms for risk mitigation. And I think that's where the BRICS, the World Banks of this world can actually help. A quick point about procurement. I think just a reflection on this notion of competition and effective competition. How do we actually achieve that effective competition? How do we encourage that effective competition? The fact is, competition is good, right? Competition does lower prices or should lower prices. And it's an iterative process. The better you get at doing competition, the better you get at driving better value. That's what we're trying to achieve here. A quick point about contingent liabilities. And from a government perspective, doing PPPs, that's the big risk, right? Or should we say the risk, not necessarily the big risk. Then the question is, if I'm looking at developing a program as a country of PPPs, I am actually going to assume a number of liabilities. Some of them are direct, some of them are contingent. how do I manage those contingent liabilities? I need a system for appropriate mechanisms to manage those contingent liabilities. The Chileans learned that one very nicely. Again, to use the Chileans as an example, they did their road projects from 95 onwards. They had a minimum revenue guarantee structure for all of their projects. And what happened was that 2 of their projects actually called the guarantee. So suddenly there was a bit of a panic in government saying, ooh, you know, we've let 112 projects, we've got 2 of them where the minimum revenue guarantee got called, what could happen? And there was no system, no integrated mechanism to deal with that. So as we go forward, yes, it is about reducing risk for the private sector. At the same time, it's actually about having the right mechanism to develop and to manage contingent liabilities. And that means that if you are a Vietnam, you're a Laos, you're a Myanmar, doing that properly actually helps your fiscal management. So doing these things in tandem is very, very important for countries and very important to actually get that right. Anyway, I leave you with that reflection, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Clinton. Please be seated. Thank you for coming in. He just landed a few hours ago from Singapore. Actually, he's still sleeping, maybe. But anyway, I just one follow-up question, very quickly. In your position as lead over there, as lead finance manager for the World Bank on the infrastructure projects, my question is, what are your baby projects and nightmare projects? Thank you. Off the record.
Off the record, right? In front of everybody. Look, we have a big challenge at the moment with Vietnam, frankly. Vietnam's a country that's been looking at PPPs and structuring PPPs. And the World Bank there, the World Bank Group, through IFC, through World Bank, in partnership with ADB, we've been looking at sort of the upstream policy side of things and the transactions at the same time. So recognizing that, you know, it would be ideal if we could create the PPP law and we could get everything nicely lined up. But if we did that, we'd wait another 5 years and get nothing done. So the strategy has been to sort of do a dual track. And developing the PPP law has been an interesting challenge because there's some political positions that countries tend to take that sometimes are based on the right reasons, right, the right sentiment, but that are not necessarily the best things to promote real PPP. In the case of Vietnam, they got burnt a few years, about 9 years ago, providing some foreign exchange protections to a couple of investors. They are adamant that they're not going to provide any foreign exchange protections, right? Well, let's be very honest. No Forex cover. I'm not bringing my granny's mother into this, right? So those are the sort of things that from a policy perspective, we've been sort of struggling. I think that, again, it's one of those iterative processes that sort of you have to help move on. And I think that's sort of the one that keeps me up at night.
What about the baby projects? What are the projects that you proudly show to your grandchildren?
The ones that I proudly show to my grandchildren. In this region?
Yes. Oh, you seem skeptical.
This region's a tough region for projects.
We talk in public. Okay. Anyway, I would like to invite our first speaker, Heath Peters, the CFO for the CLP Group, to share his insights on the topic. Heath, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You had a connector?
Yes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to speak here about what CLP has done in the field of infrastructure in the region. And we've heard lots already from what banks can do, but we've also heard that they want private investors to do not only the sweat equity, but also the financial equity. And actually, if you look at CLP, what we've been doing, the company is more than 100 years old. It started in 1901 with a generator set of 75 kilowatts. Now, more than a century later, that is about today, we are about 300,000 times bigger when mentioned from that perspective. And all that is infrastructure. I put several milestones there, and in particular, and in the interest of time, I would just focus on the milestone in 1985, when CLP facilitated China's first nuclear power project, construction of the Daya Bay nuclear power plant. You remember who the leader was then, was Deng Xiaoping. This was a public-private partnership. Hong Kong signing off on the offtake of the nuclear power, CLP investing equity, a listed company, in that venture, and PRC and European contractors starting a new generation of infrastructure. Since, we've gone through other innovations. We've invested in wind, in solar, in India, and China, amongst others. So it is our core business. We've been doing it. We've been doing it with different sources of capital, and we've been doing it for over a century. Next slide. So very quickly, just to remind you what the size is of our company as of now. If you measure it by revenue, it's about 100 billion Hong Kong dollars. If you measure it by market capitalization, it's about 160 billion. All this for a company that just invests in power infrastructure in Asia. Next slide. We heard from Dr. Lee what are the criteria for good investments. Well, I'm happy to say that from an equity perspective, we completely share them. He will recognize some of the words. We weren't synchronized here. But what we see as the mission for CLP when we invest in infrastructure is to balance three sometimes competing priorities. First, what we deliver, given it has a long-term impact on the environment and on people's life, needs to be sustainable from an environmental perspective. Secondly, as mentioned before by Dr. Lee as well, a good project needs to make the goods available to civil society. It needs to be reliable, it needs to be safe. Thirdly, it needs to be there at an acceptable cost. Now, these three objectives very often compete, and you need to look for a global optimum. We benchmark ourselves, we do this permanently, we see this as our mission. We benchmark ourselves against the other global players, and as you can see, from the emission perspective, we went hyperbolically down in the past 20 years. As you can see from the tariff perspective, we compare very favorably with similar geographies and cities. And last but not least, none of you, neither do I, who arrived here 6 months ago, wants to be stuck in an elevator, and thus our reliability needs not only to be comparable, it needs to be extremely good compared to those. So this balancing act is our mission, and in addition to that, and as we speak about it today, it needs to be sustainably profitable economically as well. Sustainably, that means reasonable, not volatile over time, but enough to attract, of course, the foreign capital, the non-public capital that was just mentioned here. How do we look at the opportunities for our business in the world? Well, it's a little tough to say, but today you can almost, from the utility business, have a very polarized view about the world. On one side, you have the OECD economies, so-called mature economies. They don't grow anymore. They have an aging population. And so in addition to that, they think and they thought they were very wealthy and have subsidized renewable. We spoke about subsidies. It's not that I'm against subsidies, but it's a dangerous product to use. And if you look in those geographies, Germany, for example, Australia, you get subsidies that destruct existing capital. It leads to unreliable power, very expensive prices, and not necessarily even the best environmental solution. That's a very complicated place to be in these days for industry. On the other side, there's still the fast-growing markets. They combine fast-growing economy, they combine low usage per capita of power and thus potential to increase, and an emergence of civil society. They combine a correlation of power demand with GDP growth, and they have all the desire and the will. It's not that they just go at it without taking environmental considerations into consideration, all to the contrary, as we will see. But they come up with a mixed solution of environmental solutions and other competitive power sources. We see this in the emerging economies, in the BRIC in particular, and I'll zero in the I and C of the BRIC. Next slide. As you can see, the I and C of the BRICS, and we too can bring charts, not only the World Bank, but we borrow them maybe from them. As you can see, we have GDP forecast there. We all know, we can discuss about, will there be 7, will there be 5? At least they're positive, 3, 4, 5 in China, India, as you compare them with the rest of the world. You also have the charts there about the per capita consumption, and you do see here, of course, that China as well and India, a fortiori, have a lot to catch up. Now, China and India are markets that have created opportunities for us and that are moving on in the field of private-public partnership and wants companies like us to invest, and we've done it. In China in particular, we've invested in highly efficient thermal coal plants that can bring in imported coal in the southern provinces of Guangxi. We have invested there. We invest in large-scale renewable in wind and solar. In India, we've invested in the thermal field. It's more complicated, but we are now investing significantly in the renewable field, and we're the biggest operator there with 1,000 megawatt. If you look at the challenges in China and India, there's still challenges. As we know, of course, there is a pollution issue in China. So if you go back to this trilemma, you see that new focus will be more on the green than just on the cost. There is still an issue of reliability as well. Significant investments need to take place in the connectivity. I heard you say that an infrastructure needs to be seen in its network, and indeed, that phase is still there. Same kind of issue, different issue, but same fundamental thing is in India. So investments in thermal plants were attracted, but no investments are taking place in the coal industry, in the gas industry, in the railroad industry, and thus these projects are starved of fuel. Unless if you have had the fortitude like us with our coal plant to put one that can import coal, which we do, and we thus help the Indian system. Similar thing for the grids. All these windmills are very competitive and interesting for India, but they need to be connected as well, and thus investment in grid is required. And for that, as we know, India has to help itself by lightening its bureaucracy. So, just a couple of minutes on a peculiar situation. It's still our home market. It's the biggest market in which we are, and I would call it the Hong Kong exception. Remember, I spoke about two polars, one where you have no growth and where it's negative demand and where it's very difficult, and where you have a mix in between subsidies and competitive markets, and that's an explosive mix. The other one where you have the emerging markets. If you look at Hong Kong, as we all know, industrial demand for power is not increasing. We have deindustrialization. Yet, we still have growth, 2-3% in our demand, because there's new growth coming. As we have transportation projects, MTR, fast rails, as we have data centers coming, as we will see in the future, mobility needs both from e-vehicles. And as we have still further demographic inbound growth in Hong Kong, we have further growth ongoing. We also see emerging greater interconnectivity with the southern provinces. This goes back again to the network system ID. And then last but not least, I'd like to remind you that in Hong Kong, we have a special arrangement. Basically, we have a contract between the private investors and operators and civil society through the government, representing and negotiating for the civil society. That has worked pretty well. It has avoided overinvestments. It has led to the results that I mentioned, and that has been a very good formula that fosters public-private partnership without extremes. And we see that as other mega cities emerge around the world, actually more and more even look at this model. Last slide. We've been speaking here about investment, private investments, and funding. It has already been mentioned, and I would just be repeating that the needs will be large. I want to make the case for our company that for a century long has been able to combine different sources of financing. Stock number 2 in Hong Kong. So we get equity from around the world to invest in infrastructure, and people trust us doing this. Very strong rating, A-rated. We get debt, cheap debt from around the world to invest in these ventures. We also contract project financing. We're trying to do it in Vietnam, and we're plagued by the challenges that you just mentioned. We've done it in India, we've done it in other places, we do it in mainland China, although liquidity is more of a challenge there indeed these days. But the leadership has said what they have said very recently. I'll let you read it there, but it's very clear that it is in favor of opening the market of infrastructure. There's a long way to go if you note that 90% of the power assets as of today in China are still state-owned. We see and we note that China is coming to the markets with their SOCs, so you get a blending of private companies investing in public-private partnerships and public companies coming to the markets of private capital. And similarly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that he wants to step up privatizations for all the reasons we mentioned. Thank you.
Before Jason, also one very quick follow-up question. Heath, thank you for the great presentation. One macro, sort of a macro level question from the Asia's perspective, energy sector's perspective. What are the sort of countries that need the kind of investments desperately to sustain the so-called growth?
Well, to begin with, of course, China still has significant quantum of investments to make. They have significant programs. There is a significant nuclear program ongoing. There is a lot of help for the renewables, and we're very involved in that one. And I think as well, and this may be less clear, or it is less open for public-private partnership, but it might come, there is going to be significant investment still required in connectivity and networks. Because if you bring in more renewable, and the cities are most, as we know, the cities are on the coast, the renewable resources are more in the mountains and to the west, that connectivity investment is going to be significant. If you look at India, if you believe, and for India to go through their ambitions of 5, 6, 7% growth, tremendous investments are going to be required in power generation. Thailand has a program, it was mentioned already, that is working pretty much. We have a small investment in solar there, but there's lots of local competition. There is available capital over there. There are 3, 4 players. I used to be a board member of one of those, the Glow company, they're listed. That works pretty much. They don't really need much help. I would say Indonesia, similarly, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, they will need help. But then, again, on a relative scale, the quantum is big for them. If you compare it with the numbers for India and in China, it's just the size of one big investment in those places. So I think the capital should be available there to help those countries, provided they do what is required structurally.
Very good, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to refer you to an article on China Daily Asia Weekly today. There's what you just mentioned, President Xi Jinping and Modi there, and the 2, 3 articles on the infrastructure topic for your reading. Our last, not the least speaker, Mr. Jason Yang, Deputy Chief Executive for Bank of China. Please, Jason.
Thank you. Peter's a while ago highlighted one of the projects CLP had, which is the Daya Bay nuclear plant back in 1985, which is a very successful public-private partnership project. I think I cannot let it pass without mentioning that that project was financed by Bank of China. The speakers before me obviously have clearly highlighted the importance of infrastructure development as a growth driver in many countries, particularly I think in developing countries. I think it is also a very convenient option for anti-cyclical fiscal policies when governments need to have boosts in the economy. Then infrastructure projects obviously comes into sight. I think most people, when we talk about infrastructure, most people would relate it to brick and mortar projects like bridges and roads, power plants, energy, and so on and so forth. To us, as a commercial banker, the other side of the infrastructure that we think about is the financial infrastructure. And these days, as Alex started the seminar, I think low capital market people can start a discussion without mentioning Alibaba. To us, Alibaba is a threat. I think these days more and more people are investing in mutual funds, in financial products through the internet. There are various types of mobile payment now in the market, which threatens the position of banks and credit card companies. So with the listing of Alibaba and the huge amount of money that they can raise, we keep our fingers crossed on how they can erode our business. Well, back to the more brick and mortar subject of infrastructure, I would just like to share some numbers on how important infrastructure development is in China, particularly to the growth of China. I have here some year-to-date numbers from January to July this year. Infrastructure investment in China has gone up by 25%. In its contribution to GDP has gone up from 5.5% last year to 10.9% this year. Its share of total investment growth has also gone up from 11.7% last year to 22.4% this year. So obviously, infrastructure investment is still a key engine for growth in China, and will continue to be the case. When we look at the long list of projects that China needs in terms of its infrastructure, we have traffic congestion, we have power outages in some areas of the country, we have urban flooding, we have ecological, environmental challenges, we have sewage, water treatment needs, air quality, food safety. I think there's a long list. Last but not least, the development in the high-speed railway. There are more than 100,000 kilometers of total mileage of railways in China, of which high-speed account for 10,000. And another 12,000 high-speed railway is to be built. And we understand from numbers in China that from 2013 to 2018, during the 5-year plan, more than 3,000 kilometers of railway will be built in 37 cities in China. These are huge numbers. And right now, most of them are financed either by direct public funding by the central government or indirect public funding by various financing vehicles in local governments. The third source of funding, obviously, is from the private sector. But right now, it's predominantly financed by banks. The financing by capital market in China is very, very much underdeveloped. Our colleague from World Bank highlights what public-private partnership can do in further providing financing and project management initiatives for infrastructure development. Obviously, I'm not the expert in that regard, but from a commercial banker perspective, what we believe is most needed in terms of private partnership in PPP projects is the public sector oversight and the regulatory framework that can give confidence to private investors. And I think particularly in developing countries, where the political situation is unstable, this would be the biggest deterrent for banks and private investors to participate in those projects. We're talking about projects lasting for decades. We're talking about projects with cash flow sometimes very much influenced by the political situations in the country. And that explains why banks in this regard are reluctant to participate. For Bank of China Hong Kong, I've checked with my colleagues, we did have one project so far in China that we co-financed with ADB. And that project was not guaranteed by ADB, but at least in terms of the allocation of funding into different tranches, meeting the different parts of the needs of that project, that works out for a commercial bank. But these are few and far between. And I think we need to work out frameworks that can give sufficient confidence to banks if we were to continue to promote this financing mean. But that being said, banks can contribute by more than just providing funding. I think the capital market is definitely something that we need to work on. In this regard, Hong Kong is actually very well positioned to contribute. If you look at the capital market in Hong Kong, you look at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, there are more than 250 companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange whose business is infrastructure related. Together, they account for around 25% of the market capital of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. But other than that, there is not a lot of funding by debt instruments in Hong Kong, to say the least. When people talk about renminbi internationalization, when people talk about Hong Kong as an offshore renminbi center, and there has been a flurry of issue of renminbi bonds in Hong Kong, I take a stock check of the renminbi bonds issued so far. Since 2007, there are more than 462 renminbi dim sum bonds issued in Hong Kong. And out of that, only 18 issues were infrastructure related. In terms of the amount of money raised, it's less than 2%. So obviously there is a huge potential there for Hong Kong as an international financial center, as a gateway to China, as a free market in terms of capital flow in and out of the place. We believe there is a huge potential there, which Hong Kong can contribute. Alex a while ago mentioned about AIIB, BRICS Bank, and all that. I think with this is, as in all cases where supranational organizations are involved, particularly when they are funded by national government, by governments, and the voting rights are allocated on the basis of the funding and so on and so forth, there will be bound to be geopolitical considerations. And for that reason, a capital market will be apolitical. It will be entirely market-driven. It will be driven on the merits of the projects. And for that reason, I believe we can work together to provide an alternative means of funding rather than relying on public funding or funding by supranational organizations. I will leave it at here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Gentlemen, just one quick follow-up on this RMB, the internalization. Jason, where does Hong Kong stand in terms of the RMB denominated funding on these infrastructure projects? What's the potential? You mentioned dim sum bond on infrastructure projects is so small as a percentage, right? But I suppose Hong Kong as a major international financial center, do you see huge potential for Hong Kong to issue more RMB denominated dim sum bonds on infrastructure projects?
Well, definitely. First of all, China is a big player in infrastructure development. So it will be a natural user of RMB funding. And Chinese contractors, you can see, are seen everywhere in Asia, building all sorts of projects. And for that reason, RMB funding will also be a useful means of financing those projects. I hesitate to say that I think Hong Kong has been underused by World Bank and other supranational organizations in terms of fundraising, particularly with dim sum bonds and all that.
Why is that?
Why is that? Shareholders, I think, is the name of the game, right? I think that the issue of shareholding does play a very important role. I agree with you. I think that if we can use the capital markets to look at projects on their merits, and I think that should be the big driver. I also think that it doesn't have to be driven by one of the institutions. I think the notion of pooling public funds that get pooled through the BRICS Bank or the AIIB or World Bank or ADB and goes into projects in a pooled fashion would sort of lower that sort of politicization of the projects, right? And then if you can combine that with a capital market structure, then it makes sense, right? Then it really makes sense. I think the challenge in PPPs, particularly greenfield projects, is involving the capital markets early on. That's where I think Hong Kong could play a really interesting role in terms of devising structures that would allow the capital markets to enter into a PPP project early on. Because today they don't, right? They don't because if you have a bond issuance, you want to have that nice, solid return of cash, right? So you can pay the bondholders. Well, I challenge us all to think about what could be done by using precisely the multilaterals or the BRICS banks, the IIBs, to actually backstop that early risk, so that the capital markets can come in quickly, right? Instead of waiting for 5, 6, 7 years when the project is mature and you've got that nice, robust revenue. Well, actually, if we could come in much earlier, then we'd have something really that
really
would
good.
move us.
Hey, the CLP Daya Bay plant project was a classic case. In fact, at that time, some 3 decades ago, can you share with us how you sort of organized the funding from the stock market, from your equity?
Oh, I wouldn't say it was a classic case. It was a really innovative. It was a very innovative case.
It's such a big scale.
So it brought many parties together. There were export credit agency fundings. There was the funding from the Bank of China. There was the equity, and there was also the commercial structure. I think that was very important to recognize the fact that the strongly capitalized utility of Hong Kong signed off on the offtake and would feed the cash flows, brought all this together in a project financing with very different parties. These days, project financing goes around the world in different formats, as we mentioned it before. So, yeah, I really like to mention that because we speak about all this in public-private partnerships, and in the public-private partnership, I think I'll take this opportunity to insist a little bit as well on the point partnership. And it goes back to what Dr. Lee said as well. One of the things that we need to really be mindful when we do this is not just to look at the project itself. We want to look at it, does it fit the three competing elements, but also how does it fit into the priorities of the socioeconomic area, its network itself. And there's this partnership point is very important as well, because you do want the contracts to be honored over time. You don't want to have surprises. The investments are for 20, 30 years. And so it's also a matter of looking at, is this asset fitting into the broader interests of everyone? Is it not just some people pushing? And sometimes you can get a project done and then it ends up a white elephant or your contracts are not respected. We at CLP attach a lot of value at relationships, at working over time, and working with the civil society in identifying which projects are important for them.
Thank you, Heath. I want to open up the discussion. We have maybe just a few minutes for one or two questions. So far, we heard this morning my personal take, market openness, competition structures, and the financial sector is opening up and so on, are key concerns on this issue. Yes, please go ahead. Yes, David.
David Dodwell. I spend a lot of my time working on behalf of Hong Kong business in the APEC Business Advisory Council into all of the APEC activity, where obviously infrastructure building is a critical issue, which actually China has been giving high emphasis to. I'm slightly concerned about some of the directions that China has been driving it this year, even though I think it'll come right. We spent a full day in Beijing about 3 weeks ago discussing infrastructure building challenges and discussing too the Asia Infrastructure Bank. It was quite a worry that over the course of an entire morning driven by Ramin Dashui, that's doing all the research work for the Ministry of Commerce on infrastructure building, all of the emphasis was on the need to raise cash. The word risk wasn't discussed in the morning at all. It took until the panel with the World Bank, with the Ministry of Finance in China, and the ADP for the word risk to enter. From the private sector vantage point, and I think we concur with the World Bank's work here, the huge infrastructure challenges we face have much less to do with the availability of money than they have with the mitigation of risk.
So David, what's your question? Sorry.
I think it's important to make the point because so I'm not at this point asking a question. I'm simply saying that the discussion is being driven in an inappropriate direction at the moment, with the emphasis being focused on how we get access to more money. The message consistently to us in the work we've done is money is not the critical blockage. The blockage is project preparedness, and the blockage is risk mitigation. Now, in APEC, with the business community, we are driving an initiative called the Asia-Pacific Infrastructure Partnership, APIP. APIP comprises at the moment, about 75 experts in infrastructure funding. It includes the World Bank, IMF, but a large number of private sector participants in the construction of long gestation projects. That group, APIP, makes itself available to sit down in private circumstances with any government that wants to meet it to talk about why PPPs are not being funded.
Okay.
And I think that more work needs to be done on something of this kind. So if anybody wants to know about, or if any of you as experts in this area are interested to join that group of 70-odd private sector experts in long gestation funding, we'd be pleased for you to join this working group to help governments around the region.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Anyone would like to? Thank you.
Just to make a very quick comment, I fully agree with you. PPP actually, when I discussed in Singapore and other places, I really believe there are two things. One is that how the government can build up this enabling environment to attract capital. But on the other side, how the participants from the private sector could be more professional. They should work each other. At the same time, talking about this money, when I met with AIIB people actually several times in Beijing, I said that World Bank, ADB already did a lot of good things. If AIIB can be kind of a knowledge-based bank, not only providing this as capital, but also sharing experience, sharing knowledge, sharing these good stories with other countries, then that's be more helpful.
Good.
Yeah, from the perspective of a private investor and being very accountable both to our equity holders and our bond holders, we do agree indeed that we would want there to be more discipline in selecting the right project. I'm hopeful that, and I agree with you, it's all about getting access to capital, but if it is getting access to capital, international movable capital and capital markets, and bringing them into the mix, then I must hope and be confident that discipline of use and capital allocation will bring towards better decisions. This is where we need to be careful. Infrastructure banks, etc., need to help and sometimes put layers, but again, watch out for the perverse incentive indeed to give cheap money directed towards the wrong project.
Thank you. You want to have 1 minute? And you?
I agree with you. I think certainly there's risk involved, and I think not enough discipline has been built into all these infrastructure plannings and developments. I think a lot of projects in China rely very much on bank financing, and banks are now very much constrained by capital. So with evolution of that, discipline will ultimately have to come in, because banks cannot continue to bankroll unsustainable projects.
Thank you. We have only one last question. Please go ahead. Yes.
Hello. Robert Gibson. We've spent this morning without talking at all about the Green Climate Fund, which is being set up in Korea, perhaps rightly so, as it has no money at the moment. But tomorrow in New York, there's this high-level summit which the UN has, where countries are going to be making commitments. So we are told that massive amounts need to be spent on infrastructure, both to adapt to climate change and also to develop economies in a low-carbon way. Part of the idea of this Green Climate Fund is that it will provide the public risk money, or money which can de-risk investment, so that the private sector can get involved, and that it will be a big source of PPP activity. Can the panel comment on it? Thank you.
Okay, we heard you. Peter, go ahead. Sorry. Very quickly, yes.
Very quickly then. In the map that you put up at the beginning, I noticed Hong Kong wasn't a port of call on the seaborne Silk Route. So my question is, in the prioritization of investment in infrastructure in China, is there in any way, does anyone perceive a goal to somehow eviscerate Hong Kong's economic vitality and create more dependency on the mainland as a long-term strategic goal?
Wow. This question takes maybe a few hours, not a few days. I give you the number of the CY Leung's office. But seriously, I agree with your question. This is very important. I think Hong Kong, as Jason as just mentioned, Hong Kong does have a place, have a role strategically to play in financing or getting the financing. But not only the financing, as Dr. Lee just mentioned, Hong Kong has a huge knowledge base of these kind of disciplines, right? And then we can obviously work with multilateral international organizations. I still think we need to talk to Jack Ma. My rationale is very simple. If Alibaba.com can raise such a huge amount of money in New York, Hong Kong perhaps should be able to raise at least equal amount of money on infrastructure projects, because infrastructure projects are bread and butter for people in Asia. Alibaba.com is a dream to a reality in a sense, but these infrastructures projects are bread and butter projects, sustaining our generation, our future generations. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this morning. Thank you. Thank you.